Hi, my name is Attorney David Gibbs, and I want to thank you for taking these next few minutes with me to discuss one of the most important lawsuits that have impacted our country in the last few years. The name Terri Schiavo brings up many memories as people remember back just a few short years ago as the world watched what the United States of America would do with this disabled woman. You'll remember that the parents wanted to keep her alive, and the husband, who would ultimately prevail, wanted her to die. It went to the White House, it went to the Congress, the governor's mansion, the legislative halls. In early 2005, it was the #1 news story around the world. It pulled people in from all across the political spectrum. If you think about this, I've never seen it before, but in your lifetime, have you ever seen an issue where Rush Limbaugh and Jesse Jackson agreed on something? But interestingly, both those men thought Terri Schiavo should live. Yet with all this media coverage, all this attention, as we now look back on this case, what I discover is that people are fundamentally confused. They don't understand what really happened. Many people say to me, David, this is basically a sad end-of-life case. This young girl was dead or dying, and she was on life support, and the parents wouldn't let go. But you know, when you dig deeper and find out the facts, that Terri Schiavo was as alive as any person watching me today. She breathed on her own. Her heart, her lungs completely functioned on their own. There was no disease in her body that was ending her life. She was alive and she wasn't dying. You say, well, Mr. Gibbs, what is the fuss about? What was the lawsuit all about? Terri Schiavo, because of her disability, could not feed herself. She couldn't do what most of you could do. She couldn't reach out and take food and water and put it into her own mouth, and that then required that people help her eat. So the whole case determined whether we would take away food and water from an innocent woman who couldn't feed herself. And that was the issue that was put before the courts. You say, well, Mr. Gibbs, I kind of heard that she was, a vegetable, or that she just didn't even have any responsiveness, or that she was just completely toasted. And I heard that too, and was completely shocked the first time I went to see Terri Schiavo. I'm with her mom and dad, Bob and Mary Schindler, and as we walk into the room, I'm expecting a medically severe situation. I'm expecting monitors and medical personnel, and I'm completely shocked to find Terri Schiavo sitting in the room in a blue lazy boy chair, like you'd have in your living room, listening to the radio, playing with some stuffed animals, sitting there all by herself. She wasn't even eating at this point, so nothing's hooked up to her. As we walk into the room, I'm then surprised again, because I'm wondering in my mind, will she respond? Will she interact with us? And I'm completely startled as Terri squeals and jumps forward in her seat and gets all excited at the presence of her mother. Mary Schindler, Terri's mom, and I believe there's a bond between a mother and a daughter that just never goes away. Mary bent over, and as she would kiss her daughter and say, Terri, honey, I'm here to invite you and show you some new friends, and I love you, honey. And as she would kiss her daughter, Terri Schiavo would turn her head and kiss her mother back. Now, not probably as good as most of you could control your mouth, but to me it always looked like she was nibbling or gently chewing on her mother's cheek. Mary then said, honey, I want to show Mr. Gibbs what we've been working on. And she said, honey, I want you to say I. And I understood that in these brain-injured conditions that the doctors will tell us a lot more gets in, but communication, expression can be exceptionally difficult. And all of a sudden, Terri Schiavo would struggle and respond to her mother, I, real loud, right back at her. Mary said, oh, honey, you're doing good. Now I want you to say love. And Terri Schiavo would get the L real strong. La, right back at her mom. Now you have to understand, Mary Schindler's a stay-at-home mom. She doesn't have any medical background or physical therapy training. She's just doing what she thinks would help her daughter. And Mary would sit there and do this dozens of times, say I and say love, and then she'd say you. And I never saw Terri say the yous, but she would try so hard to communicate with her mom. I did some things that would be rude if I did them to you. I was talking and I went behind Terri Schiavo, so I'm standing directly behind her. She's looking forward in the other direction, and I would talk over the top of her head. Terri Schiavo would twist and turn to see what I was doing and what I was talking about behind her. Her response to her dad was completely different. Her dad was from the Philadelphia area, had a mustache, and sometimes didn't shave his chin as close. And he'd come in and be a little more aggressive with her. He'd say, now you get all excited for your mom and you squeal when she comes into the room. And he would say, now I want you to give your daddy a kiss. And boy, as he would turn at her, she would purse up her face, make this lemon face like to avoid the kiss of her dad, turn her head and giggle. Now, was Terri Schiavo disabled? Absolutely. I hope and pray that anybody watching this video, I hope that you have good health. I hope that your family, your loved ones, the people you care about, I hope that they have good health and never have to face a disability like Terri underwent. But here's a young lady who is alive. She's not dying. All she needs is food and water to stay alive. And she's responding. She's recognizing people. She's giving basic communication. She's basically paying attention to what's going on in the room around her. And so here you have Terri Schiavo. And we decided with a court that she could have her food and water taken away and slowly die a death by dehydration. You say, well, Mr. Gibbs, now I thought this case maybe dealt with her wishes. I mean, what did she want? And they talk about in the law the right of self-determination, that you should be able to decide what happens to you medically. And that is the law. Now, I caution people to make sure any decisions you make are entered into prayerfully and thoughtfully, and to think about your faith and what you believe before you decide anything of this nature. But the law does allow you to self-determine or to make these decisions. Interesting, in the Terri Schiavo case, Terri never did that. She never had a living will. She never had any medical documents. She was only 26 when she collapsed. And the husband kind of flip-flopped in how he handled all of this. To give you a very quick timeline, Terri Schiavo's 26 years old. And she collapses on the floor of her home and would suffer a temporary deprivation of blood and oxygen to her brain. And that would create the disability that would be with her the rest of her life. And Terri, in the early days, 1990, her husband gave directives. He said, do everything you can to keep my wife alive. And Terri began to recover and do quite well. I'm told that she was actually walking a little bit with the help of bars and speaking more clearly in the early 90s. And then they began to run out of money. And the husband got the idea that we'll sue some doctors. And he proceeded to sue some doctors for malpractice and actually stood before a jury in 1993 and said, I want to take care of my wife for the rest of her life. He asked for $20 million. The jury didn't give him $20 million, but he was given a multi-million-dollar verdict. And right there in the year 1993, 1994,